This is Mrs. Palmer-Quay with the first video for Unit 13 on the respiratory system. This video will look primarily at the structure and function of this system. The respiratory system has a number of important roles. Of course, its most crucial role is gas exchange, bringing oxygen in and letting carbon dioxide go out. But it also has a number of other roles. The respiratory system is just involved in general in having the air exchange between the lungs, where we're having this gas exchange happen, and the outside environment, so you can continually have fresh air come in. The respiratory system also has a number of mechanisms to protect the respiratory surfaces. Some of those are related to the immune system that we've been studying. The respiratory system is involved in producing sound. You're hearing the sound of my voice for this video, and it couldn't happen without my respiratory system. It also is important to bring in the stimulus for your olfactory receptors, or your sense of smell. And it has a role to play in acid-base balance and your water balance and your body temperature regulation, which we won't really get into in this unit. The events of respiration can be put into 5 different categories. You have initial ventilation, the air moving in and out. Then you have external respiration, which is the gas exchange happening between the alveolar cells and the capillaries in your lungs. Then there is the transport of the gases through your circulatory system to body tissue. Then you have internal respiration, where the gases move out of the blood and into body tissue. And finally, cellular respiration. The whole point of getting oxygen to your cells is that they can undergo cellular respiration and make that ATP that you need to do the rest of your living. The respiratory system can be divided into 2 parts, the upper respiratory tract and the lower respiratory tract. So we're going to start with the upper respiratory tract, which basically is everything in your head and the upper part of your throat. The upper respiratory tract is very important to condition the incoming air. The air inside your lungs wants to be in the same, similar environment as inside your body, so about 98 degrees, nice and humid. Well, you realize that most of the air that you're bringing in from the outside is not in those conditions. And so the upper respiratory tract is very important in warming and humidifying the air. You can have a very good example of this if the weather happens to get cold here in South Carolina, or you go someplace skiing where the temperatures are quite chilly, and you walk out into that cold air and take a big breath through your mouth. Your body's reaction will be to cough, because that air is much too cold and dry to be entering your lungs. So that the upper respiratory tract is there to bring the air into proper conditions to be able to be entering your lung cavity, I guess, thoracic cavity where your lungs are. In your nasal passage, if you remember way back when we were looking at the bones of the skull, we talked about some conchae. You didn't have to memorize this particular bone, but in the nasal passage there were some scroll-like, some curling over pieces of bone sticking out into the nasal cavity. And when they're covered with the mucous membrane, they're often called turbinates instead of conchae, but I've seen them both ways. And this is something that helps slow down the airflow, like you had in your lymph glands when you take a flowing fluid like air or lymph and send it through numerous channels and around corners and such. It will slow it down. And so that slowing down process is also very important to allow the warming and the humidifying to happen. Your upper respiratory tract is also very important in filtering out pathogens or irritants that you do not want to get down into your lungs. Starting right in your nose, the hairs in your nose will trap small particles, and then of course most of the respiratory system is filled with ciliated, pseudostratified columnar epithelial cells, which have mucus-producing goblet cells beside them. And so that your cells, the mucus is being produced, it's very sticky, so that the bits of dust and whatever bits of irritation are coming in through your airway, and any pathogens, they get stuck or adhere to the surface, they get trapped in the mucus. And so then the cilia are constantly moving this mucus. They are moving it toward your pharynx towards the back of your mouth, down from your nose and up from your lungs, so that it can be transferred to the esophagus and get sent down to that high acid environment of your stomach, so that the stomach acid can get rid of those pathogens. So here's a picture of the nasal cavity, and of course I mentioned those conchae, or here they are called turbinate. There are 3 of them, and this is a side view, just to kind of go over some parts of the skull. If we remember, we've got our frontal bone here, and you've got the sphenoid bone providing the base of your, and the ethmoid bone, the base of your cranial cavity. In the jaw, you have the hard palate and the palatine or palatine bone, and you've got a soft palate here which does not have a bone to the back of your mouth. Then there are sinuses that we've got a sagittal plane here, so that we don't see where they, don't see the size of the sinus, but these sinuses actually drain into the nasal cavity, which is why they can get filled up when you have an infection of your upper respiratory tract and then become quite painful and give you a sinus headache. But you've got several sinuses around your body. And so the airflow comes in through the nares, which is just the opening for the hole. We have the external nares here, your nostrils. Then we have the internal nares at the back of the nasal cavity. You actually have 2 nasal cavities on your face, a right side and a left side. And you have a septum, a dividing bit of tissue right down the middle. So all of this, there are ciliated cells all along here, and nasal hairs, things that are going to be trapping anything coming in, and then the cilia are moving the mucus this way so that it will go down to your pharynx and be sent to your stomach. Here's another picture to show you the sinuses, and they sort of are set up as if you have a cross going right across the front of your nose. But I just wanted you to notice here's sort of a cutaway version of those turbinates or conchae. You can see that there really is a lot of constriction of the airway. Things, the air has to swirl around through all of those bony protrusions, and that will definitely slow down the airflow and allow warming and humidifying to happen. Here's just a slide example of your epithelial cells. So we've got the cilia on top, and these are pseudo-stratified. They look like there's more than one layer because the nuclei are in different levels, but they're really just a single layer. And then the goblet cells are what produce the mucus. Here we have just a diagram over here on the right, and just to give you some comparison between the drawing and then the actual slide. So moving on down through your upper respiratory tract, after you move out of the nasal cavity, then you move into the pharynx. And so the pharynx can often be divided into 3 particular areas. You have the nasopharynx right up close top to the nasal cavity, the oropharynx at the back of the mouth, and then as you move down into the larynx, it will be called the hypopharynx or the laryngopharynx, just depending upon which book you're reading. So the pharynx is where respiration and digestion come together. For whatever reason, God designed us that we have 2, probably for good reasons, we have 2 ways to get air in, since respiration is so crucial. So you can breathe in air through your nose and also take it in through your mouth. Your body prefers it to come through your nose, but in a pinch you can be a mouth breather. And then we, of course, are taking our food in through our mouth and sending it down into the digestive system. So it's very important that we have some way to keep air going to the lungs and food going to the stomach. And a little flap of cartilage called the epiglottis is very important. It is sort of shaped like a trash can lid, and here's where it is on the diagram. And so you can see sitting here, it is attached on the anterior side, and it will move down to cover the trachea. This is your trachea going to the lungs. The esophagus is in the back. Trachea is towards the front. And so the epiglottis will, when you swallow, it will move down, and your larynx, your voice box, will move up. And you can feel that happen when you swallow. So this will close off the opening to the lungs and allow food in your pharynx to travel down your esophagus. So as we move down the airway, we move from the pharynx into the larynx. As I said, you go past the esophagus, or go past the epiglottis, which is sort of a lid to the whole thing. The larynx is an enlargement of the airway between the pharynx and the trachea, and it does have a framework of cartilage. There are several distinct parts of cartilage that you don't have to memorize for this class. But we know the larynx as the Adam's apple that you can feel on the front of your neck. It's more prominent in men just because there's a little bit more cartilage laid down there. It's also right where your thyroid gland is that we've been studying in the endocrine system. In the larynx, you also have your vocal cords, so it's the start of the trachea to the lungs, but it's also the vocal cords, which is where we're sending sound through. Sound is being shaped by our lips and our tongue, but the pitch is being determined by your vocal cords. So here's some diagrams of your larynx. We have an anterior view, so the cartilage here is what we're feeling as the Adam's apple. This is the hard part of the cartilage that you can feel on the front of your throat. Here you can just see the tiny top of the epiglottis. We've got a posterior view here so you can see a little bit more about what the epiglottis looks like. As I said, it looks kind of like a lid to a trash can. This big cartilage that you can feel as the Adam's apple is the thyroid cartilage because it is right then, the thyroid is right behind that, so it's closely associated. And you can see as we move down into the trachea that it has rings around it. We'll be talking about those in a minute, but just take a note. Here's a sagittal section, a side view. So again, here's your epiglottis that will flip down and cover the top of the larynx so that food will go to the stomach and not down to your lungs. The actual larynx has the epiglottis on top, but there's a glottis underneath it, and that's where those are your vocal cords that can actually come all the way together. So that when you are just sort of breathing normally, the position is open about this much, and if this would be the anterior side and posterior side here, so just kind of orient yourself on how these are opening. But in the resting position, they are about halfway open, let's say, or partially open. This is when you're normally breathing, you're not talking, not making any sound, air is just moving in and out. If you're taking a deep breath, the glottal folds can be pulled apart even further by the little muscles here so that you have lots more space in your airway, and you can sort of feel that if you can kind of consciously open your throat and let more air in. And then when you're going to be talking, they really are very close together so that you can set up a forced vibration in that column of air coming up your trachea. And so there's not much space between them. We have an example down here of whispering, but there's just, tiny, tiny bits of room for the vibration to be set. The closer and tighter the cords are held, the higher the pitch. Also, there's a difference between men and women. The vocal cords are thicker in men, which is why they tend to have lower voices, because a thicker string will vibrate at a lower pitch. Here's an actual picture over here on the right looking down someone's throat to show you a fairly open glottis. So now let's move into the lower respiratory tract. So we're starting at the trachea, starting at the larynx, that's sort of the dividing line, and moving on down into the lungs. The trachea is a flexible tube. It has, as I showed you on the larynx picture, it has all these rings of cartilage. There's about 20 before the trachea divides into the two bronchi. And then this is just a transverse section of this trachea showing you here is this cartilage in a C shape that provides the structure to the trachea. This allows the trachea to always be kept open. You don't ever want to have a collapse or constriction of your airway because that oxygen is so crucial for your life, so that it has the cartilage there to make sure it always stays open. And it does it. From dissecting chickens, I can tell you, it's stiff. You can't make it collapse by pinching it. It stays open. The cartilage, though, is a C-shaped. It's not an O-shaped. It has sort of this space in the back that's just flexible tissue, and that's because your esophagus is riding right behind here. The esophagus most of the time is fairly flat, but when food comes into it, it will expand, and so it'll push this way and that way as a bolus of food travels down to your stomach. So by having the cartilage end before you run into the place where the esophagus is snugged up, that allows this part, this section of your trachea, to move in a little bit when a piece of food comes down, and then it can reset back out again. So that design allows the esophagus and the trachea to sort of be buddies, side by side down your throat. The bronchial tree are the airways that move once your trachea divides from that division point to the very, very end of your the tube system, the respiratory system. Actually, we should say the conduction system, the air that's being conducted down into your lungs. And so the trachea divides into a left and a right bronchus or bronchi, then they go down to bronchioles, and finally to alveolar ducts. There is cartilage, but as you move down into the lungs, you get less and less. So things are changing through the respiratory system because function is changing. So there's less cartilage in the bronchi than there are in the trachea. There's no cartilage at all when you get to the bronchioles, but then you have smooth muscle layers increasing. This should say muscle. Sorry, I see I missed a word here. This should be muscle. Smooth muscles are increasing as you move away from there's no muscles in the trachea, but there's a little bit of muscles in your bronchi, and then there are more muscles in your bronchioles so that they can actually constrict, which can be a problem with someone like asthma. When asthma hits the bronchioles, the muscles have constricted, and that is obstructing the airways, and that's why people wheeze with asthma. We'll get to disorders of the respiratory system a little bit more in the next video. And then the cells, which are ciliated through much of the respiratory system, have to gradually change to plain old squamous epithelium, because when you get down to the alveoli, down to the place where gas exchange is actually happening, you just want one tiny little layer of cell. You want one small, skinny, flat little squamous cell there so that there's not much space for oxygen to have to travel to get into your bloodstream. So as we move through the bronchial tree, the purpose changes from conducting air to actually respiration, or the exchange of gases. Here is a bronchogram. I'm not quite sure what technique they used to get this nice illumination of the bronchial tree, but you can see how it branches down smaller and smaller like a tree, just hanging upside down, but as it moves into the lungs. So now we're down to the alveoli, the very, very end of your air tube. There's a large surface area happening in your alveoli because you have a single layer of squamous epithelial cell that are laying within little tiny balls that are laying within capillary beds. And actually everything is so tiny and small by that point that you've got the epithelium of the capillaries and the epithelium of the alveoli sharing one basement membrane. So you've got a cell layer that's your alveoli, and then you've got the basement membrane, because all epithelial cells have a basement membrane. It's one of the definitions. But that basement membrane on the other side of it has another cell that belongs to I forget what I said, capillaries? Did I start with alveoli or capillaries? But they're just side by side, and so this is a very small distance that oxygen and carbon dioxide have to move across, and it can happen very quickly in just tenths of a millisecond. There are 3 types of cells found in your alveoli. You've got the cells on the wall, which are these basic squamous epithelial cells, and so they're known as type 1 cells. But it's very moist in there in your lungs. Of course, we talked about how your nasal cavity or your upper respiratory tract is humidifying everything. And that's because inside your lungs it has to be moist. The gas needs to be able to dissolve into a fluid to move. And so there's a fluid layer on the inside of the alveoli. But the fluid layer tends to want to collapse, there's the word I want, collapse the alveoli. And so you've got other cells that are producing surfactants, which are high lipid molecules. They reduce the surface tension, kind of what happens when you put a drop of soap, if you have a drop of water, you know how it will mound up. Water wants to sort of make a little ball, but if you put a drop of soap in that, it'll spread all out. And so surfactant breaks the surface tension, and so it helps decrease the chance of your alveoli just collapsing in on themselves, pulled down by the surface tension of the fluid. And then the other really important cell that you have at this very end of your respiratory system are macrophages and other dendritic cells, or other phagocytic cells. Dendritic cells may be there as well, that are very important in taking care of any pathogens that may not have been caught in the mucus on the way down. We want to make sure that we identify those invaders and take care of them. And so your immune system is on the job there in your lungs. So here are some pictures just showing that. So we're coming down the various bronchioli or bronchioles into the alveolar ducts, into these little alveolar sacs, and then the individual little circles here, like little grapes, are the alveoli. And then moving over here, here's a diagram showing you've got a big empty space in the middle, which is containing all of the air, and then you've got your little type 1 cells that are very, very flat here, you can see on the membrane, just giving you almost no distance for that gas to go over. And you've got your capillaries right up next. These cells are sharing a basement membrane so that gas can move in and out of the bloodstream, oxygen can move into the blood and carbon dioxide can move out. And then you have your type 2 cells here that will be secreting a surfactant to allow all these alveoli to keep them from collapsing, help them keep open and inflated. Okay, so now from that tiny look at single cells down in the alveoli, we're going to jump back and look at the lungs and sort of some big picture stuff again. You have a right and a left lung, of course, hidden in your thoracic cavity, and they are bordered by the diaphragm on the bottom and really pretty much your ribs on the top. They are divided in the middle by something called the mediastinum, which is the collection of tissue that divides the thoracic cavity in half. Your right lung has 3 lobes and your left lung has 2. So your left lung is slightly smaller. One of the 2 lobes are not the same size as in the right lung, so there's not a tremendous difference that might be implied by these 2 different numbers. But the left lung has to share the space with the aorta and a little bit more of the heart. The heart is roughly centrally located. That's why CPR works, because you're pushing up and down on the center of the chest, and most of the heart is under there. But it does cant a little bit to the left, and the left lung has a little indentation known as the cardiac notch to allow that heart to snug up over there. So between that and the space for the aorta to travel down the descending aorta on the left side of the body, the left lung is just not quite so large. The lung is surrounded by a pleural membrane, and this is a serous membrane. And if you remember, the serous membrane is the situation like you're punching your fist into a balloon. And so you've got 2 layers of membrane, and this is just a very extreme, very, very simple graphic. So here's your inside. This would be your lung in here, and the outermost part of that membrane is the parietal pleural membrane, because that's kind of the wall, and then this one is adhered right to the surface of the lung, and that's known as the visceral layer of the pleural membrane. And there is a potential cavity between the 2. There's not really anything more than just a tiny bit of fluid in there, and so that would be the pleural cavity. You want these to stick tight because it helps the lungs stay fully inflated. You've got a little bit of suction going in between the 2 layers. They don't want to separate because of the fluid in there, and so that helps keep your lungs from collapsing. If someone experiences a puncture wound, some kind of stabbing or something, it may let air into the pleural cavity, and then you will have a pocket of air. You will have these 2 layers separating, and then the lung itself may collapse as that inner layers is kind of pulled by some of the other forces that are going on in the lung. So here's a picture of your lungs, and you can see, as I said, the lobes are slightly different in size. There's your superior lobe, or your upper lobe, right and left side. So you can see it's a little bit bigger in the left. And then there's a middle lobe on the right side. as well as the lower lobe. So excuse me. There's not a tremendous difference between the right and the left so far as size, but the left is a little bit smaller. You can see here how your diaphragm is coming tight to the bottom of the lungs. All of this is very tightly tied in with membrane, so that when we get to the breathing, you'll see the diaphragm is going to pull down, and there's just no choice. Everything has to go down with it because it's also tightly connected. So why do we get air in? How does breathing work? Well, it's all because of pressure differences. Those of you that have had physics will understand this maybe a little bit better. But we're looking at over here this illustration with a syringe. You know, if you pull down on the handle of a syringe, then air will rush in. And what you have done in this case is you've taken the amount of molecules that are inside the space and you've spread them out. And so you've lowered the pressure inside the syringe. And so outside pressure is still higher, and it comes in because nature abhors a vacuum. It does not want to let it stay at a lower pressure. And if you go the other way, you're increasing the pressure inside this syringe because you're squashing those molecules into a smaller space. And so, of course, they're going to want to get out of there if there's an opening because they just don't want to be squashed. And so this is what's happening inside your lungs. You're not seeing huge changes in pressure, but just enough to get the air to move. Normal atmospheric pressure is about 760 millimeters of mercury. This is how we measure atmospheric pressure. It's about how much the pressure would push up a column of mercury in a thing very similar to a thermometer that's called a barometer. And so by pulling down the diaphragm, by contracting the diaphragm, which pulls it down, you expand the thoracic cavity, and it reduces the internal pressure by spreading out those molecules over a bigger space. You take it down about 2 millimeters of mercury. And that's enough to move air in. Air will just come flying, will flow in because it's a lower pressure area. And then when you're done inhaling and it's time to exhale, basically your body will just relax and let the elastic fibers in your lungs and in the muscles surrounding your lungs to pull everything back together with a little bit of recoil. Surface tension as well helps pull things back together because it wants to go so far as to actually collapse things. And so then the interalveolar lung pressure goes up to about 761 millimeters of mercury, a little bit above atmospheric pressure, and that allows the air to rush out. So here's some just diagrams showing that. Inspiration, the air's coming in, the diaphragm is being pulled down by contraction, the muscle fibers are shortening, and so they move down, and that will decrease the pressure in the lungs, in the thoracic cavity, and air will be flowing in. At the same time, you may also be involving your external intercostal muscles, the muscles in between your ribs, the muscle that you eat if you happen to eat ribs in a restaurant or at home. And so if you think about, if you kind of pay attention how you're breathing, when you're sort of relaxed and breathing, your lungs are moving apart a little bit, and the external intercostal muscles are basically pulling them out and up. In expiration, or exhaling, your diaphragm then relaxes and it returns to the upper level, so that allows the elastic recoil to happen. If necessary, you can involve some more muscles. You could involve your abdominal muscles here to kind of continue to push it back up so that the pressure increases in the thoracic cavity. Can involve some of the other intercostal muscles. The posterior intercostal muscles can also be involved in decreasing the size of the thoracic cavity. Different intensities of your breathing will move different amounts of air in and out of your lungs. You already know that. And we measure that with a spirometer, and we're going to be making a homemade spirometer in lab this coming week. So when you're just relaxed and breathing, you're breathing about somewhere between 12 and 20 breaths per minute, and about 500 milliliters of air is moving in and out. It's sort of the average. Smaller people obviously are moving smaller amounts of air than our larger people. This is known as the tidal volume, the amount that's going in and out when you're relaxed and you're just sort of breathing, you're chilling there. Normal breathing is a rhythmic involuntary act. It's part of your autonomic nervous system, but you know that your respiratory muscles are also under voluntary control. So when you're at the doctor's office and they tell you to take a deep breath, you can do so because you can override the involuntary actions and have your, make some choices in how you breathe. You can also hold your breath and decide not to breathe for a little while at least. So here's a diagram of some of the different types of volumes that you can see happen. Here in the center is your tidal volume. And so this is that 500 milliliters or so, that if you're just sitting here and you're breathing and just kind of, relaxing here, in and out, you're just moving that much air. But if you take a big deep breath and let it out, then you're filling up your inspiratory reserve volume. And that's about 3,000 milliliters. That's how much air you can put into your lungs if you take a really big breath and take all of the air in that you possibly can. And if you are just breathing in and out and you try to blow out all that you could possibly blow out, that's the expiratory reserve volume. So that's blowing out all that you could possibly blow out. And if you take the measurement from the biggest breath in to the biggest amount out, that's known as your vital capacity. So that's sort of the max that is possible under your control. But that's not all the air that's in your lungs. There is a residual capacity that is made up of the air that's in between spaces. When you breathe all the way out, it doesn't just collapse down. There's still space in there. So there is still air in the alveoli. There's still air in your bronchial passages. There's a certain amount, and so you're going to have, that's known as the residual volume, that you absolutely cannot possibly get rid of it. But then there's also a small amount above that, that's your functional residual volume, that you would only get rid of as if you, I remember falling off a bike when I was a child and hitting the ground very hard and not being able to breathe because I had all my breath knocked out of me, and I think I probably was going into the, heading over this line here into my residual volume. That was a very scary few moments. I was very glad when I started breathing again. So the things that you want to know here is that the tidal volume is being an indicator of what you're sort of ordinarily breathing. Your vital capacity is the maximum that you can breathe in and out. And you've got reserve volumes both for inspiration and expiration, the things that are under your voluntary control, your largest amount in or the amount that you could blow out. Let's talk a little bit about gas exchange and how that happens. So we talked about the pressure that allows air to come in and out of your lungs. Well, that is pressure, again, that determines how gas diffuses across the cell membrane. And in this case, it's the pressure of the two gases that we're most concerned about, oxygen and carbon dioxide. Since we're not talking pure oxygen or pure carbon dioxide, we're talking about air where it's a mixture, we're really talking about partial pressure, how much of the air is oxygen. And in the air, oxygen represents about 160 millimeters of mercury, whereas carbon dioxide is about 0.3 millimeters of mercury. So gas will move down the concentration gradient. We're talking diffusion here, and so things will always move from high to low. So this first diagram on the bottom of this slide is showing what's happening in the lungs. Here's your alveolar wall, those cells, those single thin epithelial cells. And inside the, this is your air inside, so you've got about 160 millimeters of mercury sitting, air pressure in the, on this side of the alveolar wall. And so oxygen will move in, and it moves in with about, to a level about 104 millimeters of mercury is taken up by the blood, so that your alveolar blood, the partial pressure of oxygen, that's what this PO2 means, is about 104 millimeters. And since you always have air in your lungs, the gas exchange is happening all the time, even when you're breathing out, so that it stays pretty stable. You also can see the difference between carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is about 40 in the alveolar area, and so it's 45 in your blood, ready to be moved out again down the concentration gradient. So oxygen has moved into the blood, carbon dioxide has moved out, but oxygen has moved in. How does it get carried? Well, we've talked about how it's carried by hemoglobin. Oxygen's transported by the heme portion of hemoglobin. That's where the iron molecule is. And it is a fairly weak bond. Oxygen, if there's not too much excitement, it'll hang out with heme, but if it's in a place where it feels like it's more needed, it's going to let go. And so this connection breaks when the oxygen reaches the body tissue for areas that have a greater oxygen need. And so the oxygen will leave the hemoglobin and move. So down here in your diagram, we've got the left-hand side here is showing the alveolus again in the lungs, but over here on the right, we're talking about what's happening in the tissues. And so the oxygen is leaving the hemoglobin molecule here and moving into the tissues because the oxygen, there's a low level, the tissue cells have a partial pressure of oxygen of only 40 millimeters of mercury, and they're saying in this diagram that by the time it got to this cell, it was about 95 millimeters of mercury. So that in actuality, much of the oxygen that is being carried by the blood is staying bound to the hemoglobin. So it's not all falling into the body tissues when it gets down to those capillary beds. And I think you probably could figure that out because you know that if you hold your breath, you don't immediately faint from lack of oxygen. But there's obviously some residual somewhere, and so it's a combination of being residual in your lungs and also residual in your blood. So not all of the oxygen leaves the hemoglobin. A good portion of it stays attached, kind of to go on to the next tissue and see if it's an oxygen debt. As it circulates around the body. So carbon dioxide is transported in a few more ways. It's a little more complex. There's 3 different ways that carbon dioxide is moved. A tiny bit dissolves in the plasma of the blood. Another small amount binds to the hemoglobin, but it's actually the globin part of the hemoglobin. It's not the heme molecule like the oxygen does. So it binds to the protein part of hemoglobin or the amine part of hemoglobin. So we have the carbaminohemoglobin as when it's carrying carbon dioxide, or it's oxyhemoglobin when it's carrying oxygen. But most of the carbon dioxide actually is transformed into bicarbonate ions and carried in the plasma until it reaches the lungs. This is because the carbon dioxide combines with water to form carbonic acid. We see this little reaction here. And we really don't want to increase the acid level of our blood. We want to keep the pH very carefully controlled. So that disassociates down to hydrogen ion and a bicarbonate ion. A hydrogen ion can also be carried by hemoglobin. Hemoglobin can kind of buffer it and keep it from making things acidic. And the bicarbonate ion moves out into the plasma. And bicarbonate is actually a buffer. It doesn't affect the pH particularly. It's what makes up Alka-Seltzer that people take when their stomach is upset. And those of you that did chemistry with me, we did do a buffering activity with bicarbonate ion. So you might remember that. So it doesn't really affect things in the blood when it's traveling as bicarbonate, and so that sort of is a safe way to get it. When we get to the lungs, this process reverses. The bicarbonate comes out, it recombines to form carbon dioxide, and then that can diffuse out and be exhaled back into the air. Now I want to talk about regulation of breathing, what controls this breathing. We've got respiratory centers in the medulla and the pons in the brainstem. You might remember that from when we talked about the central nervous system. And so they're sending out signals on a rhythmic pattern to keep us breathing. It's part of the autonomic nervous system. They also respond to times of emotional stress and physical activity when we need to have that breathing rate increase. There also are sensory receptors that monitor carbon dioxide levels primarily. And so when carbon dioxide levels start to climb, more carbon dioxide needs to be exhaled out, and so the breathing rate will increase and in a response to the sensors picking up too high carbon dioxide levels. There also are mechanoreceptors that monitor the stretching of the lungs so that you won't take too big of a breath when you are exerting yourself in physical activity. You don't want to strain things. Here's a picture that explains a little bit of this with some diagram, that you have, both increasing and decreasing of your respiratory rate can be controlled by what's going on, emotionally. You can slow down your breathing if you're going to relax and practice meditation as long voluntarily as well as autonomic. But many of your autonomic responses are to increase the breathing rate. So you see here your chemoreceptors will increase the breathing rate. Both the ones that are found in the brainstem itself, and we've got some in the carotid arteries and the aortic blood vessel as well, will also increase it. And then the stretch reflex will reduce the breathing rate because you don't want to pull something. You've got various proprioceptors, that's the sense of where you are in your muscles and joints, that play into that, along with the other senses that would possibly help you or be necessary for you to increase your breathing rate in a response to something that's going on. That you're experiencing pain especially might bring up your breathing rate. So all of these different things go into your pons and medulla in your brainstem, and then the response goes out down your motor neurons to change your breathing rate, to go down the phrenic nerve to your intercostal muscles and your diaphragm to change how often you're taking a breath. And finally, I just want to mention there are some non-respiratory air movements. These are things that are not really involved in gas exchange. For example, you may cough, and this really is response to having some irritation hit your pharynx or your larynx or your trachea. If you get a little bit of liquid or food starting to go down into your lungs, you can have quite a spasm of coughing because your body does not want to have anything into your lungs other than air. Sneezing is likewise a response to irritation, but sneezing, it's the irritation to your nasal passages that trigger that. Hiccups are just a spasm of the diaphragm, sort of the diaphragm and the glottis are working together in an unhelpful way to give you the hiccups. And yawning, they used to say yawning was because you needed to increase the amount of oxygen in your blood. Really, now they've pretty much disproved that hypothesis. So the actual reason for yawning is not quite understood, and we really don't understand why if someone yawns, we yawn too. In fact, they found that even if our dog yawns, we yawn, or if we yawn, our dog may yawn as well. So there's something interesting with yawning that we don't quite understand. So that covers what I want to talk about in this first video. The next video, there's one more video for this unit, and we'll cover some disorders of the respiratory system.